Good evening, everyone. We'd like to celebrate International Whiskey Day by having Heather Greene here. She's the CEO and master blender of Milam and Greene whiskey. So she's going to do a introduction for us. To give a little brief bio and background on Heather. So Heather Greene, she's CEO of Provision Spirits, a top-selling whiskey author. She is the world leading spirits expert, one of America's media's favorite go-to thinkers on the topic of spirits, and the author of Whiskey Distilled, a populist guide to the water of life. She was the director of whiskey education and sommelier at the Flatiron Room in Manhattan from 2012 to 2014, where her classes sold out regularly. She was the first American woman to serve on the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in Edinburgh, and her biggest passion today is running Provision Spirits, developing their whiskey program and building the business nationally. Her written work has appeared on Eater, CNBC, Town & Country, The Daily Beast, and she has appeared nationally on media outlets such as CBS, This Morning, Bloomberg News, Fox, the Food Network, and MSNBC. So I guess we'll pass it over to Heather.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. My name is Heather Greene. Thank you for the introduction. Now, I just want to give a quick announcement that underneath I see that it says Jennifer Holm. My name is Heather Greene on this video, so please excuse that. But I'm very, very excited, and I really is so excited to be here to talk to you guys about whiskey. It is National Whiskey Day, and this is something that I have done for many, many years. Actually 20 years to be exact. I've been in the whiskey industry, and it's just something that I found absolute extreme passion with, and really excited to be here. So I can't see any of you, but I'm going to assume now if you guys are able to chat, one of the things that would really be great is for me to be able to see if you could just all do like on a scale of 1 to 10, like I just want to see like 1s and 10s and 5s, what your level is with the topic of whiskey. So if any of you guys can do that, that would be great. So we have a lot of responses here. 7s, 5s, 7s. I went to a tour of the Scotch Whiskey in 2017. No, not yet, not right now. Okay, excellent. I'm excited. So we have newbies. Let me start from the beginning. Whiskey is an umbrella term. Okay, so whiskey means water of life. It's an old Gaelic term, and it means water of life. So wherever grains growing around the world, wherever we have grains growing around the world, some crafty, as I like to say, some crafty farmer probably made whiskey out of it. It's a very, distillation we think is probably about 5,000 years old now. So as early as people were looking at condensation on the back of something they were cooking, so basically distillation is steam, and then it condenses again back into a liquid once it's cooled. So we know that this is just basic things that happen in earth, right? And we know that it's been going on for a long time, but really in the Gaelic countries, so speaking countries, Scotland and Ireland in particular, this is where they really fleshed out the art of distillation, and water of life is the word that they used for that. And over time, it became known as whiskey. Whiskey ba is the way, well, I'm not a great pronouncer of Gaelic, but it's basically that old Gaelic term. So it means water of life. Where we have grains growing, somebody probably made whiskey out of it. Whiskey at its basic form. Now, this is what really confuses a lot of people. At its basic form is water, that's easy, yeast, and then grain. A lot of people say water, yeast, and if they're from Scotland, they'll say barley. If they're from America, they'll say corn. So it's water, yeast, and grain. So we can actually use different kinds of grains from around the world to create our whiskey. Now, what happens, what differentiates all of this, what makes it a lot more complicated, is that where we make whiskey, the big whiskey producing regions, so if we were to take those, that would be United States, Canada, Ireland, Scotland, and Japan, who've been making whiskey for about 100 years now. So these big whiskey producing regions, while you just have water, yeast, and grain, they have this unbelievable cornucopia of flavor, this tremendous, unbelievable variety of whiskeys that can be made from those 3 ingredients. And those variables are going to come in the form of so many different things. They're going to be because of your grain. What kind and type of grain are you using? What kind of still are you using? What is that distilling apparatus? What are the laws around which you can call your particular whiskey a Scotch or a bourbon or a Japanese whiskey, etc.? So we're looking at all of these different variables. Then you look at, of course, the type of cask you can use, the type of, the container of your maturation, and then what we call terroir, which would be your environment, all of these different things that come together to essentially create your beautiful basically your characterful whiskey, if you will. So I want to take you through that. So that's really the umbrella term. The most important thing to remember is that whiskey is an umbrella term. So we're starting at the beginning, and a lot of people get that confused. Is bourbon a whiskey? Yes. Is Scotch a whiskey? That's a whiskey as well. Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskey, as I said, Canadian whiskey. So if we think of the whiskey as the umbrella term, right? So we've got this big umbrella term, and then in Scotland we have Scotch, in America we have American whiskeys, and then we kind of actually can start seeing it branch out. So we're starting to see the architecture. In Scotland, there are actually 5 different kinds of Scotch whiskey. Okay, so we're going to focus very much today on a particular kind that is very famous. It's called single malt Scotch. We'll get into what that means. So there's a single malt Scotch, there's grain Scotch, there's a blended grain Scotch, there's single grain Scotch, there's blended whiskey, there's blended Scotch whiskey, blended malt Scotch whiskey. So you have all these different kinds of Scotch whiskeys. Moving over to Ireland, you've got the same thing. You have Irish whiskeys, but you have single malt Irish, you've got pot distilled Irish, and so on. Then we go over to America, we have American whiskeys, and you guessed it, we're going to spend a lot of time here because this is where not only is it that I make whiskey of this style now, but it's really just, there's just unbelievable curiosity, tremendous growth that whiskey people like myself can't actually keep up with the demand. And that's called bourbon. So we have bourbon. We also have rye. Another really hot whiskey right now is Japanese whiskey. So for any of you whiskey collectors, it's very hard to come by a Japanese whiskey these days. So a couple of them that are you guys probably very familiar with would be Hakushu, Yamazaki, Nika distilleries. They're making really tremendous whiskeys as well. And we'll get in a little bit to that about what they're doing that makes it so spectacular. So now you have whiskey, the umbrella term. Now you know around the world we have different styles, of course, Scotch, American whiskeys, and Japanese, and then you drop it down from there. Then you have single malt Scotch, you've got your different types of Irish whiskeys, you've got your American whiskeys, bourbon, rye, and then your Japanese whiskeys. So we start to see some of that differentiation in terms of these types you're going to see on your label. So let's start with American whiskey. What makes American whiskey so different? What's the unique character of American whiskey? So if we start and we think about the basic architecture of whiskey making. So this is something that would be really great to go over. Just that basic architecture across the world is the same. So just as I told you, water, yeast, and grain are the 3 ingredients. Those are the raw materials. Our basic architecture for whiskey is the same as well. And then within that, you definitely get into the minutia of how that architecture works to create your whiskey. So what do? You start with your grain. You're with me? So you've got your grain. What do you do though? Okay, so you've got grain, water, and yeast. How does that work? This is part of the whiskey making process that is essentially identical to making a beer. So you start with your grain, and let's say in Scotland, if we're talking single malt Scotch, it's going to be by law 100% malted barley. If you see the word malt on a Scottish label, on a Scotch whiskey label, it's a promise to you that the grain is 100% malted barley. Now, here's interesting. If you guys are all reading about bourbon, reading about American whiskeys, you see a lot of talk saying, what's the mash bill? What's the mash? What are the grains? They don't ask that question in single malt Scotch because the word malt means it must be made with 100% malted barley. You come over to the United States, they're going to start asking, what is your mash bill? Well, in bourbon, we are not restricted to something like 100% malted barley. That's what's happening over in Scotland. But here in America, we have different types of grains we can use, and that's what a mash bill is. So when people say, what is your mash bill? Essentially what they're asking you is, what are the grains that you're using to create your bourbon? Bourbon by law, so that's part of what creates the personality of our spirit. So bourbon by law must be made with at least 51% corn. It's really important. So repeat it. Bourbon by law must be made with 51% corn, at least. That 49% is up for grabs. So what are you going to do if you're a whiskey maker? You can use a little more rye if you want to, which is a big grain that we use here, actually around the world. You could use more barley if you wanted to. You could use extra corn. You could bump that corn up. You could do a lot of different things as long as you were at least 51% corn. So now we see something that starts to be different when we talk about American whiskeys. Over in Scotland, they use malted barley. So this is the first thing we do. We take our grains and we start to prepare them for something called fermentation. So we take that grain and we soak it in water. That's called basically your mash tun. They're done in mash tuns. So you take your grain and you soak it in water. The reason why this is important is because grains are filled with all those wonderful starches. And starch, as you know, from 10th grade chemistry, is essentially a long chain sugar. Okay, so we're looking to get at that sugar. We want to get at that sugar, but the seed, it's bound up in a shell. So we're going to soak it in water to soften it. We create this nice soup that's called your mash. So let's talk about bourbon. You're going to have 51 at least % corn and some other grains in there. You're going to add warm water on there, create a nice soup. You're going to add that yeast, and then the yeast is able to eat those sugars very easily. So you're just basically making it very, very easy for that yeast to eat the sugars to create two things, alcohol and CO2. We want that really great alcohol. They're going to dive into that sugar. That one-celled little organism is just going to find that the most delicious thing ever and create alcohol. And that's what we want to do. As a whiskey maker, we're looking for great yeast, because yeast can create flavor. How you mash it, how long it's fermenting. And by the way, that is the word, fermenting. It's basically the process of the yeast eating the sugar to create alcohol, this fermentation. So over in Scotland, they're using the malted barley. So they are also going to soak their water, and they're going to add yeast there too. So all around the world, we start to see that architecture is the same, but where it differs is how long is your fermentation time? You know, what kind of flavors are you trying to develop in your fermentation, in your mash? What are the grains doing? All of that kind of stuff is starting to create all the little variances in the different types of whiskey and flavor that you're ultimately going to get in your bottle. So we start with that. That's essentially a beer. Now we have this fermented liquid. What are we going to do? Well, we've got all this. We got to get the alcohol out of it, right? So now we're going to put it in a still. So we've got this fermented liquid, and then we're going to put it in a still. What does a still do? A still is an apparatus where you agitate the liquid. Okay, distillation is, and you're going to heat that liquid to create all these little beautiful molecules of flavor. We call them smelly molecules, believe it or not, but they mean smelly in a good way, mostly. So smelly molecules, you're basically taking, when you're creating a distilled spirit, whether it's brandy or gin or any of these other things, you're heating that liquid to create steam and then condensing that again into a liquid. So what does the distiller do? Marlene Holmes is our distiller at Milam and Greene, and she's been doing it for 30 years at Jim Beam, for example, before she moved on to work with us. She's an incredible distiller. What is she doing at that still, though? She's trying to take that, there's that fermented, liquid that's basically low percentage of alcohol, but we want to extract the flavors and we want to extract that alcohol, condense it again into something much more high proof. And the way she does that is by tweaking the knobs, tweaking the temperature, tweaking the timing of that to start kind of, we call it volatilizing all those beautiful little molecules. So there's ones that smell like apple and maybe banana, or some of we call them esters. So for those of you who are into chemistry, you're going to know a lot of these things already. Aldehydes, esters, beautiful aromatics. It's like perfume, same way concept of perfume being made. You're capturing and you're raising all these beautiful molecules and then condensing those again. And then that becomes this white, almost like, well, it's essentially moonshine. So when people ask me what moonshine is, it's basically that pure white spirit coming out of the still. And the same thing happens in Scotland. The same thing's happening in Ireland. You're getting these beautiful stills. So the still size and type is going to affect your flavor. Do you have a little short, squat pot still made of copper? And, you know, if you like go over to the Macallan, for example, they're short and squat. So these little molecules, you know, you get the heavier ones, they can get up and over pretty quickly. They don't need a lot of energy to fly up like a swan all the way up and over. Those are the lighter, like I think more ethereal notes that the distiller is capturing. At Glenfiddich, they've got these beautiful, big, giant copper pot stills where they're capturing the liquid. Over in Ireland, at Tullamore Dew, if you guys have that, they're the largest of the group of the whiskeys that we're tasting tonight. They have giant pot stills. And then you look where we are at a small craft distillery in Texas, we have a 300-gallon pot still. It's actually quite tiny. And I'm going to make sure that you guys get some of these pictures after, because I had some pictures that weren't able to load up and I didn't want to bog us down with all of that terrible technology mishaps. So essentially, we have a tiny, tiny pot still. So pot still look like, if you can close your eyes and you're like, what does it look like? You've probably seen them. They're copper and they look like Hershey Kisses, essentially, like a giant copper Hershey Kiss. They've got literally the belly is like the pot. And we are going to distill in those and then wash them out and then distill in them as batch distillation. So small batch distillation. That's often where that people talk small batch. Batch is traditionally comes from those kinds of pot stills, although you can have small batch and larger stills. A continuous column still is our other kind of still. So this is a giant, they can be 4 stories high. I mean, these things are enormous. And a continuous still, they were actually created by a man named Aeneas Coffey, not to be confused with the coffee that you drink. So you may, when you dive into whiskey, you're going to hear people saying a coffee still. It's named after a person, not the drink. So a coffee still or a continuous still, these giant, if you guys have been to Kentucky, they're enormous and they're tremendous and they're wonderful. They are continuously, they're fractional distillation. They're related to oil refineries, quite frankly. I mean, it's not a very glamorous thing to say, but the way they distill these giant, giant column stills, you can do that 24/7. And it also creates a different type of flavor, right? So again, now it's another place where we're going to get some flavor differentiation is how we distill our liquid. So the distiller is tweaking all those different stills for that particular flavor. In those big giant stills, fractional distillation, they call it, you can actually get really pure, high proof spirits really quickly. So a lot of your vodkas and a lot of the pure white spirit you're going to use for gin, lots of big gin companies will use those large column stills. So just to recap really quickly, we did our mashing, which is the grains, and those grains are going to change around the world. And then we go into our fermentation. That's our yeast. It's another place where we're going to get flavor. By the way, how distillers use yeast is very different at Milam and Greene, which is the company for which the company I run and make whiskey for. We use 2 different kinds of yeast. You'll see like Four Roses in Kentucky is very, very particular about the yeast they use. They do a lot of experimentation with that. Over in Scotland, very traditionally, they didn't like to mess with the type of yeast they were using for a long time because they didn't want to change the traditional flavor of Scotch. And now we're seeing a little more experimentation even over in Scotland, where it's a lot more culturally acceptable not to change too much the flavor and over time of what you are actually creating. So yeast is a big deal. So we did that with fermentation. Then we did our distillation, 2 types of distillation. We talk about the distiller creating trying to tweak and get all those beautiful molecules out, pulling them out of your liquid, all those beautiful molecules that were created actually during fermentation and mashing. We're going to tweak those out. And I should say, for those of you scientists, you really, when you're distilling, your alcohol is going to volatilize, basically lift around 173 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're just going to kind of you're basically going to just tweak that 172 degrees, but you're never going to go above 212, because then you're just bringing all that water over, and then you don't have your high proof spirit. Proof, by the way, or ABV refers to, you know, the proof, the amount of water. It refers to the amount of water that we have or don't have in our liquid. So you don't want to bring in all that water. You guys have what you started with. So that's how we tweak distillation. So imagine this little spigot comes out of your still. The first, we call them the heads. So if you ever read about whiskey, you're going to hear something heads, hearts, and tails. If you guys are, or the cut, making the cut, what is that in whiskey? What that means is that the first distillate that is condensed and trickled down are the heads. And the heads are filled with heavier, somewhat unwanted molecules. We don't really, lighter, excuse me, we don't want those molecules. We don't want those flavors. And then at a certain amount of time, we're gonna capture the heart. And that's where all the beautiful flavors are in our whiskey. And then there's the tails, and the tails, the tail end is we're also going to not use those either, because those can have some unwanted flavors in them. So a distiller will make the cut, heads, hearts, and tails, and we capture the heart. And this is where, I mean, we could just go on forever at the next process, and that's maturation. So the whiskey comes out of the still. You already have all these different factors that are going into your flavor making. The whiskey comes out of the still, and then we put them in beautiful casks. And this here is where we also have tremendous laws about what we can and cannot do, and tremendous attention to detail. So the cask, we're using cask as well. A little tidbit for you over the bar is an umbrella term. Cask is the umbrella term, and barrel is actually a unit of measure. It's 53 gallons. You also have hogsheads, which are gallons made bigger. You have port pipes from Portugal. You have sherry butts from Spain. So these are all, cask is actually a umbrella term as well. So each country is going to use a different style and type of cask. So let's use the example of bourbon again. What we do is we are now using, in order to be called a bourbon, now this might be one of the most, in addition to the use of 51% corn, what gives bourbon its most unusual character over all other whiskeys is the fact that by law, American whiskey makers, if they want to call their spirit a bourbon or their spirit a rye, they must be aged in brand new charred American oak. So what does that mean? It means that around the world, they can use our old barrels, right? So you've got all of this brand new wood, virgin wood, we call it. So brand new oak barrels. We differentiate, we use the term brand new or virgin because around the world, they don't do that. So they can, but they traditionally don't. So bourbon must be aged in brand new virgin oak. So imagine this brand new oak. It's like the first dip of a tea bag. So you put that fresh distillate in there, that beautiful whiskey, it goes in there. And then very quickly, there's an influx of color, of flavor. It's strong, it's robust, it's feisty, it's peppery, there's caramels and maple, and it's just very, very rich, beautiful whiskey very quickly. So American whiskeys, when people are coming from Scotland, they're like, how old is it? And you think, well, an American whiskey at 12 years old is actually a very old whiskey at that point. A 4-year-old is 4 to 6 or 8 is a sweet spot. Anything over 12 in my warehouse, I start to get afraid about. I'm like, is it getting too tannic? Is it getting too woody? And that's the job of what I do as a master blender, as somebody who's managing the warehouse and the inventory, or constantly tasting because you're afraid and you're constantly wondering, how is that whiskey aging in a cask? There's so many other variables. It's the sun, it's the humidity, it's all these things that are happening. It's also the size of the cask you decided to use. So when you're tasting American whiskey next to a Scotch, so I encourage you now to have all 3 of them in front of you. If you do, when you taste your bourbon and your rye, they're going to be that bigger, robust caramel. Some people are like, ooh, you know, it's a much different, sweeter profile than the others. So you move over to Ireland and Scotland, and what's really cool there is they can use our old barrels, but that doesn't mean that there's not flavor left in them or they're not good enough. It's actually, I think of it as like a beautifully seasoned pot or a beautifully seasoned barrel. I mean, that's essentially what they are. So they get to use our old barrels, and they age it a lot longer, because now a lot of that flavor, or initial flavor, has been extracted from it. They are using barley mostly, okay? So you've got barley, which is a little bit more grainy and mellow, as opposed to this big, bold corn and rye, right? And then you have these older used barrels, and then you have this temperate climate in the Celtic regions, Ireland and Scotland, where it never gets too cold and it never gets too hot. So if any of you have ever been there or lived there, you know that you can pretty much wear a North Face windbreaker year round. That's July and Christmas or Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate. So those, you never change your jacket, essentially. Here, you know, we've got like, woo, especially in Austin, outside of Austin. I mean, I don't need to remind you what happened here in Texas a month ago, but you can have these insane chilly cold spells, and then you can have this tremendous heat. So we're going to see a much bigger variance in our warehouse over here. But in Scotland, so you just imagine, I like to think of these casks in Scotland, they're sleeping gently. They take a lot more time to get that flavor into the whiskey, and it's gentle and it's simmering. And now you have, if you have one of your Glenfiddichs, if you have a Glenfiddich 12 or 15, well, that feels young in the Glenfiddich range. It's actually, 12 years old is still a pretty long time for a whiskey to be just sitting in a barrel or a cask. That's from when you were kindergarten all the way to when you started Columbia. So essentially, you're seeing that the age differences between all of our whiskeys are going to be different depending on where you are. So it was a big challenge for me. I was actually I was touring Asia quite a bit, actually teaching. I'm a huge Scotch fan, and I lived in Scotland for many, many years. I cut my teeth on Scotch. My name is Heather Greene, and I can't get any more Scottish than that. But then I wrote a book and was very immersed in the whiskey world here in America. And I was sent to Japan to teach the market over there, the differences. And it was really interesting because it was just all about age, because for so long, Scotland has been there, the Macallan and Glenfiddich and all these brands, and everything is about age. Well, because you can have a 50-year-old, a 40-year-old whiskey from Ireland and Scotland, and it just kind of develops beautifully over time. By the time an American whiskey in that brand new oak barrel is 15, we're kind of pushing it. I have tasted, a few of you know the really famous Pappy Van Winkle. I have one that's 23 years old, and I expect that to be good, but that's not usual. It is very hard and tricky to find those beautiful whiskeys at that age in American whiskey. And there's something else I should address here. You guys have heard the term angel's share. Angel's share refers to the amount of evaporation that occurs out of your cask. And we like to also call it the distiller's share and the share that somebody else might be passing by taking out of a cask. But, there's been a long tradition of people nipping from casks who work at distilleries, and I've been known to do the same. So Angel's share refers to that evaporation over time. So we're going to see a lot more evaporation in American whiskey, and that will affect flavor too, because you have less whiskey in your cask and you have a lot more exposure to that wood. So you're even getting a much faster flavor into that whiskey. So you start to see, like, when we look at Irish and Scottish whiskeys and we look at American whiskeys, we start to now, I think you guys understand, when we first started this lecture, water, yeast, and grain. And now you kind of see, like, oh my God, this could go on. I wrote, 300 pages I wrote on this. You get really detailed and you can go into all the different kinds of scotches and all the different kinds of Irish whiskeys and all the different bourbons happening around the United States and rye. And all of these things we're talking about, the grains, the yeast, the still size, the people. A lot of people forget there's something what I like to call social terroir, because whiskey is the interaction of earth and sun and grain and water and sense of place and the manipulation of man on how they do it. So there's a social terroir as well that people have their own way of and style of making it. So you start to see, and over there in Scotland and Ireland, a lot longer history. They're traditionally or mostly barley based spirits, although there is a lot of innovation and there's a lot of different kinds you can make. It just depends on what you want to call your whiskey over there. And then you tend to, when you approach the taste and the flavor of Irish and Scotch whiskey, so you have that in front of you. If you look, you're going to notice I always get, like with a Glenfiddich and a Tullamore Dew, Irish or Scottish whiskeys, a Glenfiddich, I always get this beautiful like pear, apple, a tiny, tiny hint of vanilla. And over there, if you're just drinking Scotch, you might say it's a little bit sweet sometimes and bouquet-ish. But when you sip it against a robust bourbon, so if you have Milam and Greene triple cask bourbon, you're looking at a much more vanillas and caramels. And there I definitely sense the roses and the flowers. So you get to see the very different personality between, you start to see the differences between a bourbon and a Scotch, and also the Irish whiskey. Now, Irish whiskey is really interesting because they don't have as regulated rules as you would have, say, for a single malt Scotch or a bourbon. So in Ireland, it must be aged in Ireland, of course, and in Scotland, it has to be aged at least 3 years. And in order to be called bourbon, it's got to be aged for a blink of an eye in an oak barrel. Just seriously, it actually has no age requirement, although you don't really want to do that. 1 second is not going to taste really that great, and then you got to chuck your barrel anyway. So we see there's rules, but Irish whiskey for a long time, for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, we saw the disappearance of a lot of Irish distilleries, and they're coming back with a vengeance. And Irish whiskey is just tremendously popular now. And what's interesting about Irish whiskey is that as they're coming back, they're being really innovative, just like a lot of the you see with the American whiskey makers. So you see like Tullamore Dew has all these wonderful finishes, and you see a lot of experimentation over in Ireland. Scotland as well is having that same sense of innovation, but I always think of Scotch whiskey as like, that's kind of the godfather. That's sort of like where it all was born from. And I like to think of it as a little more of a traditional, there's a lot of innovation, but I still personally tend to those beautiful like Glenfiddich 12, just classic Speyside single malt scotches. Single refers to one single distillery. Malt, if you remember before, means 100% malted barley, and Scotch, it must be minimum 3 years on Scottish soil and bottled and sold at least 40% alcohol by volume. Over here, we don't use ABV so much. We say proof. We like that. What proof is that at? And to figure that out, you just multiply that ABV by 2. So 80 proof is 40% ABV. Here in America, or actually all over the world, so that cask is rolled into a warehouse. It's aged for all these different times and different size casks. Of course, in America, we have to be brand new. When we're ready to bottle, now this is where I think consumers, when you guys go to the whiskey shelf in your store, this is where this confusion starts to really happen. You start seeing all these labels and you're like, what? I'm confused. What does this mean? So when we're ready to bottle our whiskey, like, okay, great, ready to go. I'm going to bottle my whiskey and I'm going to get it out in the store in DC so you guys can have it. Milam and Greene triple cask. What is the decision I'm making and what's happening in Scotland when they do that? Those decisions are the ones that are most reflected on your bottle. So let's take, for example, we'll use American whiskey again, because you're going to be seeing a lot of that when you go and you see bourbon, straight bourbon whiskey. So let me pull some out. Let's see. This was a limited edition. So you often see the word straight right there on a bottle, show and tell time. Straight in American whiskey means that it has been aged a minimum of 2 years in that bottle. So that's all that means. When you see single barrel, that's a decision, and this is universal, single cask or single barrel. That's when the distiller or a whiskey maker makes a decision that they're going to take one barrel and they're going to bottle whiskey from that one barrel. That's it. Okay, that's a single barrel. So that means that it comes from one barrel. A barrel here in America yields about 280 bottles. So a single barrel in a bourbon, 4 years old is about 280 bottles. It could be almost half that if you're up at a 12-year-old. So our single barrels at Milam and Greene tend to be very rare, very expensive because we just don't have a yield of our single barrels. If you don't see the words single barrel or single cask on your label, what else is happening? Well, they're mingling more than one cask together. So if you don't see that word on your whiskey, that's what that means. So single barrel versus what we call, now this is, I'm going to get really confusing again to you guys, but since you seem like you're all probably pretty smart people, that does not mean a blend. A blended whiskey is its own style, and there are 38 types of blended whiskey. Let's just not even go there tonight. That's a whole nother class. But what that means is basically you are blending different casks together. We like to say mingling or vatting or marrying because there are styles of whiskey called a blended whiskey. Okay, so if you don't see single cask, you can be sure that essentially, imagine me going into a warehouse and I have all these casks. I'm going to be putting a bunch of them together. I'm going to marry those together until I create something great. Same thing over at Glenfiddich, same thing at Tullamore Dew. You basically are looking at batching casks together to create something beautiful. That's what single, if you don't see single, that's exactly what you're getting. So you have Milam and Greene triple cask whiskey. That's 3 different casks that are coming together very purposefully. It's a 2-year-old, it's a 4-year-old, and it's a very old 12-year-old whiskey. Those are coming together and they're created to basically have an experience where you have a little bit of sweetness, you have a little bit of structure across your mid palate, and then you have a kind of a back end or a structure, I like to call it. As a whiskey maker, I'm always looking to have that experience, that kind of texture. We're looking for texture, we're looking for flavor, we're looking for finish. So that's how long or how short a finish might be. We're looking for all these different ways aroma will I guess kind of ping around in your mouth and in your brain. Actually, it is a big part of it is how you perceive whiskey is in your brain as well, obviously. So, and then we go over to Scotland. We have the same thing. Are they releasing a single cask? A very famous from sister distillery of Glenfiddich, Balvenie, had a very famous range for a long time, the Balvenie single cask series, which is delicious. Glenfiddich does a lot of experimentation. There's Solera aging. They basically finish off they dump casks into a Solera vat and they never empty that out. There's lots of different ways they can create flavor from the casking there. Again, over in Tullamore Dew, we're seeing a lot of innovation over there as well. So look at your label. Your label should tell you a bit about how they decided to age that particular whiskey. The other thing that you're going to see a lot are finishes. So if you have our port finished rye, Glenfiddich has a rum finish. I saw a cider finish from Tullamore Dew. This is when you start with your legal designation on how you make the whiskey. I have to make a rye on all those parameters I told you, right? 51% rye, bottled at 40% at least ABV, brand new oak casks, all of that stuff. It's over 2 years old, you'll see straight, all of that stuff. But then once I do all that, then I can finish it in something really beautiful. If I wanted to, I could finish it off and put it into another cask for flavor. It's like another layer and a beautiful overlay of flavor, and that is what our port finished rye is. So after we have our rye aging beautifully, actually there's a bunch of different casks that we mingle together in a vatting tank, and then we put that into a port barrel to get a beautiful flavor of that port over our rye. Just pretty finish over that. Over one of my favorites, I always loved the Glenfiddich rum. I don't know if anybody was able to, if anyone felt like getting that. There's also different Caribbean casks you would start to see in whiskeys, other port, sherry. This is basically, they're doing what they need to do to fulfill the legal requirements and have a great base, and then they finish that into their casks after. So you see that a lot on labels, like, so now if you see something like straight, single barrel straight bourbon whiskey finished in something like that, now you kind of can break down and understand exactly what's going on in those particular in that particular bottle. So again, this is just another way you start to see how those three ingredients, water, yeast, and grain, is just branches out into just an infinite amount of ways that we can create character and flavor for a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. So if you are drinking, I should actually pour myself a glass too with you. It is Whiskey Day, National Whiskey Day, but I am a couple hours behind you, so I didn't really start yet. I will. But essentially, we really, again, I just want to remember whiskey is an umbrella term. And once you start understanding what to look for when you taste a whiskey, there's a whole world that opens up. It is just, I made a whole living out of it. I drink it for breakfast. I mean, it's just like there's a whiskey for every occasion. I don't have a favorite whiskey. It's really about occasion, just like wine is. I mean, you can have your picnic whiskey with ice. You can make a cocktail whiskey like an old fashioned. You've got after dinner whiskeys. You have whiskeys by the fire after skiing. You have somebody else buying you whiskey that's very expensive on their business tab. That's a different kind of whiskey. I've seen people order that way. Rare whiskeys. I mean, there's all different kinds and styles of whiskey. I do want to, one more thing I didn't address, and I know this is a big question a lot of people have, is that how do you drink whiskey? How do you nose and taste whiskey? So when you have your whiskey, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the type of glass you're drinking in. Okay, so a little dainty, tiny glass. Well, you don't want to stick your nose too far in it because we are working with 40% ABV. So you're going to burn your, you're going to anesthetize your receptors right here, essentially, and that's tough. So you want to basically just get a light perfume. Maybe Jennifer can demonstrate like how I don't know if she has her glass, like a light perfume. Yeah, she's got a larger rocks glass. I like a large rocks glass. That's how I drink whiskey. So you want to get a nice, a lot of flavor in a rocks glass will pop because there's all of the molecules. Remember, we're talking about the smelly molecules. They volatilize out of that glass as well. We like to get as much as possible. So a rocks glass will allow that. When you are working with small Glencairns or dainty, smaller holes in our mouth area, what do you call it? Lip? It's hard when we're not interacting. I'm losing my mind with that word, but a smaller opening on your glass, you're actually diverting and different molecules are going to start coming up over time. So you're going to have a different experience. Ice as well, perfectly acceptable. I love ice, especially this time of year and into summertime. I think bourbon, the bourbons I make, I always drink on ice. Absolutely. I'll do a spritz of orange or just a little bit of grapefruit and it's perfect cocktail for me. Glenfiddich 12, 15, I love those on the rocks. I even love the 21 rum finish with a beautiful ice cube in it. Don't love it too cold. I like just a little bit chilled. And then Tullamore Dew on a day like today, I would also throw that on the rocks. So believe it or not, yes, I'm the whiskey expert who drinks whiskey on the rocks. I like it. Ice is dynamic. You're adding another layer, you're adding another element, H2O, to the party, right? So it's going to change over time. You're going to have an evolution of flavor. What ice does is basically mitigates that high ABV feel. So it's just a little fresher, especially in the springtime. And I just love a really great whiskey on the rocks with a nice chunky glass. So when you are nosing your whiskey, you're going to nose the most important thing is, do you like it or do you not like it? This is so simple. You don't have to talk about aromatic notes like you're reading the pages of Moby Dick. I think it's hilarious. I think it's like so crazy when I read those notes because the science says that humans can actually only detect 5 notes at a time at any given one moment. So those 30 different aromatic notes is great marketing, but the reality is if you can get 3, I'm super proud of you. And if those are just sweet or flowers or spice like cinnamon and clove, that's great. Also making a judgment is fantastic. So we get a lot out of the nose. It passes here, it sends a message to our brain that says rose or flower or cinnamon, and they can usually evoke some kinds of memories, positive or negative, that will affect exactly how it is that you're responding to your whiskey as well. So that's a big part of the experience when you're drinking the whiskey. As you're drinking your whiskey right now in front of you, I want you to think about what it smelled like, the anticipation. Then you have a nice long finish, hopefully, or a smaller finish. Either one is okay because sometimes you want something long, sometimes you don't. And then we're think about the texture. Think about the viscosity. Is it silky when you're tasting it? Is it creamy? All these different things. Astringent. These are like different things that will happen as you're nosing and tasting your whiskey. As well, there's something called retronasal olfaction. That's as it passes back out through. So you breathe, you're tasting and then you're breathing out. So if you've ever had a stuffy nose or if you block your nose and you taste something, you're literally, there is no flavor. It's just, you're just getting the taste like sweet or sour. But then you block your nose and all of that flavor comes rushing back because it's all located up here. So nosing is a big part of whiskey. That makes it really, really fun. And it's 6:19, so I've been talking straight for 45 minutes almost. I could go on forever on whiskey. This is, my life. And like I said, we touched a little bit. I really want you to go away on National Whiskey Day. When I saw that there were a lot of news and not yet and 5s, I actually didn't believe it or not, that wasn't even really a deep dive. So we can, just starting out, what is whiskey is so important. No question is stupid here. A lot of people ask, can bourbon be made anywhere? Yes, anywhere in the United States. It doesn't have to be made just in Kentucky. Although if you're in Kentucky, do not argue with them. Questions like, if you have questions like, what does single mean? Single over in Scotland, again, as I said, means one single distillery. But over here, doesn't mean that. Again, all these different rules. Single here usually refers, if they would say single malt, it's usually an indication that that American whiskey maker is using predominantly barley, but we don't have any laws like that yet. Single here often is single barrel, all that kind of stuff. So be careful when you see the word single. It's a very, the definition of what that means changes. So again, a really fun tidbit. What I mean by that is in Scotland, single grain whiskey. I mean, that sounds really, you think, oh, single grain, what's the grain? Remember, single means one single distillery. It means grain whiskey coming from one single distillery. So a single grain could be like actually 5 grains. It's like just means it came from one distillery. So a little watch out kind of for you as you navigate those whiskey shelves. One of the resources that I highly, I mean, if you don't, okay, shameless promotion, my book will really go over a lot of it. I do have Whiskey School that I've started online. These are 3-minute classes, which is exactly what we're doing to refresh, like what does whiskey mean, going from the beginning. And that's a really fun resource if you like a little 3-minute videos. We also have Lou Bryson's book is really wonderful. His book is just called Whiskey. Tasting Whiskey, actually, I think it's called Lou Bryson. Don't forget that. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And I think he's one of the great writers who can really navigate the whole world of whiskey. A lot of writers are very focused on a particular style, but Lou does a good job too. Whiskey Advocate is a really great resource as well. If you're looking for definitions, Whiskey Advocate is my favorite place for those kinds of things, and scotchwhiskey.com, which unfortunately is no longer working, but they answered a lot of questions. They were fantastic writers and whiskey experts behind that website. So those are some further places that you can go. I would stay away from your, I'm not going to mention names, but for your big media top 5 whiskey kind of articles, I see a lot of mistakes in those, a lot of errors, a lot of people chiming in on Facebook. There's a lot of errors about whiskey. So many. Big publications that have things that are a little bit skewed or maybe not get it right, because it is very complicated and it's very difficult to navigate all these different ways we make them and the rules under which we have to make them. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture and that you've discovered one of those. If you have whiskeys in front of you, I'd love to know what you gravitate towards. Oh, one last thing. I can't stop talking about whiskey. One last thing. The whiskey you tasted first is often the most disliked. It all happens all the time. So switch them around tomorrow and then make a better evaluation. But that's just a weird thing that we've all found out, is that the first whiskey in a lineup is always the one that people like least. I think it's because your brain isn't, ready for all that flavor yet. And then it acclimatizes as you go through your tasting. I would love to open it to questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. This has been such an informative presentation. So I'm just going to read through a few of the questions for you. So John Chester, he is asking, is it whiskey with an E or whiskey without the E?
Oh, that's a very good question. I forgot to tell you. So Scotch whiskey is without an E, and no one really knows exactly the real reason. There's all sorts of fun theories about it. Scotch whiskey is without an E. So if you're writing about Scotch whiskey, it's without an E. And the theory is that Ireland came along and said, we don't want to be like Scotland, so we are adding an E. And the United States, of course, has an E. Where you see whiskey around the world inspired or emulating more, like Japanese whiskey emulating Scotland, you'll see it without an E. In America, it's predominantly with an E. There's no law or rule. Maker's Mark is a great example. They chose not to use the EY, and they're making that very complicated for the rest of us. Either spelling is okay, but as a general rule, Scotland is with an E. Scotland is without an E, Japan is without an E, and America is with an E.
Great. So another question, what are the different types of yeast?
Well, I love this question because like the different types, I mean, you're using different kinds of, there's brewer's yeast, there's all sorts of like, I don't know the technical names of the different kinds of yeast. And to be honest, most distillers, and this is really interesting, if you were to go to Maker's Mark, Four Roses is really famous for this, and Japan, you will find zero information on the type of yeast that people use and the style and the way in which they do it. In fact, even with us, the most proprietary thing of many distilleries is the type of yeast that they're using. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about yeast is that you are looking for, when you're working with yeast, you are looking for yield. You're looking for flavor, and you're looking for cost. So you're kind of working against all those different kinds of yeast to see where you're going to get the best results of that yeast. For a really long time in Scotland, they would just use your basic brewer's yeast, and they would use that in their whiskeys. And then the Japanese and Four Roses were showing that you playing with yeast over time, different strains, they're just different strains, can really influence the flavor of that whiskey. And now you start seeing yeast experimentation everywhere, which is pretty cool.
Great. So another question. You had mentioned earlier charring the virgin oak barrels. Why do you do this and how?
Sure. So charring, it's charring and toasting and charring are two different things. Those are ways we can season the barrel. So we're really, think of it as like prepping. You're preparing the barrel to receive the liquid. So wood is essentially, you've got cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignins. These are the basic constituents of your wood, and you've all these little nooks and crannies in there, and the charring of the outside kind of you're basically expanding some of those nooks and crannies. You're changing the character of that wood to allow all of that interaction of the liquid with the barrel happen. So the charring, you have char level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's something we really like to play with. A char 4 is your deepest level. And that just is basically that amount of, think of it like a marshmallow. You're literally charring it. And you're getting, it's just a way that we prep the wood to really receive that flavor, receive that ethyl alcohol with all those beautiful flavors that we tweaked in distillation. So they're getting into those nooks and crannies, or pulling the lignins out, which have flavors in them. Lignins are it's essentially the glue that holds wood together. So we're grabbing those out. And that's why we char. We look at different levels. Down in Texas, we're really finding that a char 1 or 2 is fine. We don't need more than that, because we also have the sun beating. We don't need that like really big burst of flavor added to our whiskey that already is going to happen in the hot sun down here. Toasting is essentially, think of it as like more of a gentle, you're like a high heat. You're drawing your staves of whiskey and you're toasting it. It has a different flavor. So I just think of like a marshmallow, think of burning it versus slightly toasting it. Those are the things we do to the cask to prep it for the alcohol.
Okay. And so when tasting whiskey, why does a teaspoon of water improve Scotch?
Oh, that's a great question. So that has been told for many, many years that it improves. That is subjective. Whether or not it actually improves your whiskey is subjective. Water, so older, very, very older Scotches, there was for a long time, you're like, this is how you have to do it. You have to have water. You can't add ice, or you have one ice, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. There was like, no. There's all these laws and rules. But really what we're finding now is really up to you. You don't have to add water. What water does is, again, think about it as I talked about ice, you're adding another molecule to the party. So what we're thinking happens is you add water and it just kind of opens or expresses some of the other molecules that allows some of those to pop. But also be careful, because it could silence others, right? So it's a game of all these different things, all these different elements volatilizing off your whiskey. So my best advice with Scotch whiskey is to taste it and really add it, not a spoonful, but I add little tiny bits, because you can't take away what you've already added when it comes to water. And that's what one of my favorite Scotch makers said to me early on. So I like to use a straw if you want to see and experiment whether that is the case for you. So I'm a big advocate of subjectivity when it comes to your relationship with the whiskey. Everybody is born, and it comes to the proverbial table with a different set of biology, cultural background, all this stuff that's going to affect how we nose and taste and experience our whiskey. So you don't have to do that. It doesn't necessarily always make it better, but it can. And I would say just experiment to see where you like that. And if it's very expensive whiskey, be careful, because you just want to add a little bit until you get the perfect amount.
Thank you. So now, when pricing whiskey, what makes bourbons or ryes more expensive or less expensive within their brands?
That's a really good question. So what that's called, there's a 3-tier system in the United States, and a whiskey maker, what's confusing here, if you look at us or other brands, we have one price, and that's called an FOB price. That's the price that we sell it to a distributor out the door. what happens is there are 3 other tiers to go through before it gets to the consumer. And that's where you see crazy pricing. You see bottles where they go out the door for X amount, and then there's at the store or sold on the secondary market or at auction for 10x the amount. So we've got that at play. And part of that is that the demand for bourbon in America is so tremendous that you see collectors and hoarders and flippers, just like you kind of do real estate, really. I mean, you start to see people hoarding things and flipping and doing whatever they can to save and do that kind of thing in whiskey. So pricing on whiskey is a little bit crazy right now, especially with bourbons. I would say there's a lot of hype. There's stuff that I am shocked is selling for certain amounts or isn't even in demand because it's just literally consumer hype, and it's a hunt, and then it becomes its own circus or hurricane of demand, and then people get it, and then they buy cases and put it in their basement, and then the stores have to allocate it. So you see that a lot in bourbon. In Scotch, you see it with certain brands and also in Japanese whiskey. So it doesn't happen across the board. But from a whiskey maker's perspective, what will increase price over a whiskey is that single barrel, the yield. So like a single barrel with a low yield will affect how long was it aged? Because, you know, there's inventory costs in there. How it's aged, all of these things. But I would say probably the biggest factor in pricing from a whiskey maker's perspective will be how long did you age that for and how many do you actually have?
Great. And a little bit further into a similar question is, what are the business requirements for a company to offer distillery exclusive whiskeys?
What are the company requirements? I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand the question.
So if you were to have an exclusive whiskey out there, is there any sort of requirement, legal requirements?
No, the only legal requirements we have are we have to follow those rules. We have to abide by the 3-tier distribution network. So in order for us to release whiskey in the United States, or anybody, so let's use actually very, very thick and heavy and complicated. So I have to work with a distributor in each state, and then those distributors place them in retailers or bars or restaurants. So if that particular distributor wants something exclusive that I have, they'll take it in. I can't sell it to you directly or even a store or a bar directly. I have to go through the distributor. So if there is something special, usually what happens is I would approach a distributor, or a brand will approach and say, I have 400 cases of this whiskey. Do you want it? And they'll say, yes, I think my retailers and my stores will have it. And then they get that into the store, and that's how it gets into your hands. So there's no legal thing that says I can't sell one whiskey, as long as a distributor wants to pick it up and I want to go through all of the administration of your SKUs and all that stuff, labels. I have to, every time I release a product, you have to go through the TTB, which is in DC, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Bureau. We've got labeling requirements. So it's a great question. We actually have, I'm really excited. We have a Castle Hill series coming up in April, and that's only 400 cases around the United States. It's only 20 barrels that have come together, all over 14 years old. So this is a rare, again, this would be an example of that really rare whiskey. Probably, actually, we're going to retail it, not too expensive. We're going to ask the retailers to sell it for about $130, which is in whiskey, not too bad for rare.
Great. So James is asking, what makes some bourbons like Rebel Yell sweeter than others?
So again, that could be Rebel Yell. So it could be the cask, it could be the terroir, it could be your sensitivity to certain flavors. Again, that's subjective. Some people might think Rebel Yell isn't as sweet and find something, I mean, you see that across the board, but in general, sweet. The sensation of sweet is coming from the cask. So how they use the cask, usually it's those lignans and the vanillas and things like that that will give the sweetness to a whiskey. That's why over in Scotland and Ireland, they tend to be less sweet compared to American whiskeys, because of that influx of flavor that happens quickly in American whiskey. So the sweetness usually comes from a combination. It could be the way that I forget if you can tell me the mash bill, if you have a bottle. I don't remember what their mash bill is at Rebel Yell. But also if you're using more wheat, remember I said that if bourbon has to be 51% corn, so that 49%, if you're using more wheat, those tend to come across a little bit sweeter. And that's because wheat is a gentler grain to use that allows some of that sweetness to pop to some of the mellower flavors, as opposed to rye, which is a little bit spicier, and you might have a little bit more spicy rather than sweet. So those are my best guesses.
Okay, so another question. What proof does a spirit come off the still at and then out of the barrel at to get to the final bottling proof?
Oh, that changes. That is a really good question. So when we're making, we actually, for us, it changes, right? And this is a great question because there's a lot of debate called the barrel fill proof. Should it be a 107? Should it be a 110? Should it be 120? The lower, what we're finding is the lower that barrel entry proof, right? So we get to choose that up to a certain degree. But once we get there, we're finding that lower proof, barrel proof entry actually gives a lot more flavor into that whiskey. We're just seeing that over time, but it depends on the state that you're in as well and how that affects. And as a whiskey comes out of a barrel, I mean, it really depends. I mean, we're seeing 120 proof, 124, 116. That's kind of that variable and that magic in whiskey. Over in Scotland, again, the proof of the whiskey coming out of the barrel is going to be very different there because the evaporation is what evaporates is different. So a really old American whiskey tends to not taste good, and it actually tends to increase in proof because the water is evaporated, leaving a high proof and a lot of whiskey behind and a lot of the alcohol behind, and it's getting all that flavor. It tends to get really strong really quick. Over in Scotland, the opposite happens. It's very humid, so we don't see as much evaporation in that cask. And their whiskeys at 40-year-old can dip below 40%, and they can no longer actually sell it as a whiskey. So we see there's a hard question to answer. I hope I did that okay, because it's actually, that's all over the board within kind of a range.
Great. So for Milam and Greene specifically, what other grains do you use in your bourbon and rye whiskeys?
Our rye is a high rye, so it's a 95% rye. I work with MGP. They are a wonderful rye producer in Indiana. I've written about them even before I worked here. I love their ryes. One of the things that I think is really fun about a whiskey maker that I took from my time in Japan and Scotland that is very unlike other craft distillers is I like sourcing the best materials I can get in addition to creating my own. To me, that means that I have a wonderful palette of casks to play with. We have a high rye MGP, and so it's 95% rye, and then we have those at different ages. So the triple cask are bourbons. Again, we play with it, but we do a bourbon, a rye, and then, a corn, a rye, and then barley. Now, barley acts as an enzymatic property that helps the fermentation happen. So you're always going to see a little bit of either you have to add those enzymes or you're going to have barley. So we use 8% barley, and ours actually kind of high.
Great. Okay, so this question is more about finishing. So this user, he's curious about whiskeys that are aged in rum casks, and do you like them? Is this something that you might incorporate at some point in certain places within the Caribbean, such as the Martinique? Are there two, or I guess let's see, are there two distinct spirits that could be sort of combined in a way?
I'm sure there's a lot of finishing that could happen in you could use different barrels that people are experimenting with. I love rum finish in a whiskey. I really love rum finish in scotches though. For me, I find I did like for a while, I liked Angel's Envy. They had finished it in a rum. Now it's a little sweet for my liking. Again, it's subjective, right? So, you know, you may love it. It tastes a little sweet. And that's because American whiskey is already very sweet with a lot of caramels and vanillas. Remember, we were talking about that. So you finish in a rum cask, it tends to be like sweet on sweet to me. It's a little bit more wily to use. I think there's a way to use it. We just haven't gotten there yet. We're still a pretty boutique craft distillery. So we're focused on port for the rye, which I think kind of mellows the port out and gives this beautiful dark cherry, a little bit of tannins. It adds a new character to that. I do like rum finishes in Scotch because Scotches are a little bit drier. And I have that apple, and there's a lot of pear and a Speyside Scotch. So you add a little rum to that, and it really kind of pops and expresses that. In terms of the different types of rum from different parts of the Caribbean, I haven't really noticed like big differences in flavor. I think when you're finishing with a cask, you're more looking for not the nuances of flavor you might find between different port purveyors or different rum providers, things like that, but you're kind of looking for that overall character of those notes rather than the finesse. By the time a whiskey sits in there over time, you're not going to get the nuances of the original spirit, but more the spirit of the original spirit, the kind of vibe of the original spirit, I guess is the best way to express. But sure, there's no reason why someone couldn't use a bunch of rum barrels. I haven't done that.
So what are the reputable internet whiskey sellers that are online right now?
Well, we partner with, we partner with Mash and Grape. It's complicated here in the United States because the e-commerce is growing and they all seem to have challenges. So it is growing so quickly that these e-commerce sites are during the pandemic, they actually can't quite keep up. In fact, I got some emails from some of you like that you had a tough time. They're actually at arm's length. Most of in the United States, we have to be at arm's length from these internet sellers. It's basically, I give it to a retailer, and the internet retailer that you partner with actually is picking it up from a store and sending it to you where they can do that. So Caskers, Reserve Bar, Mash and Grape. If you're looking for secondary market, third-party stuff, yeah, I can't really help you there publicly.
Okay, and then so Daniel is asking, so out of the whiskeys that we tasted tonight, 2 from your collection and then Glenfiddich and Tullamore Dew. So why were these specific whiskeys chosen?
Sure. I thought these whiskeys demonstrated really great classic styles for shameless promotion is why I did mine. So, obviously I'm hoping that you guys fall in love with Milam and Greene whiskey because we're great whiskey makers who love whiskey, but they are good. We didn't try to do something crazy. I'm not making sorghum whiskey. I'm not doing anything totally crazy here. Milam and Greene's purpose was to create some of the finest whiskeys that can compete with Kentucky whiskeys with myself and Marlene at the helm. And in fact, they are. We just got a bunch of awards from Wine Enthusiasts, which will be announced in June. I'm very excited. We were in lots and lots of press. I just think we make a really nice classic bourbon, a wonderful, interesting rye that doesn't deviate too far. So I wanted you to have a bourbon and a rye that you can find. I mean, obviously I couldn't tell you to go get like something rare. It's tough. So really nice classic whiskeys. And then for Glenfiddich and Tullamore Dew, I always like them. I actually work for them. I don't work for them at all. I'm not affiliated with them anymore, but I did at one time. I was their whiskey ambassador many, many years ago. I just think they have really good whiskey making skills. I think they're great whiskey makers. They've been around for a long time. It's hard to taste a bad Glenfiddich. I always loved the Glenfiddich 12. It was a really nice, remember the younger a whiskey, Scotch whiskey is the closer you are to all the the fermentation and the fruits and the mash, all the other stuff before too much wood sets in, or more of the woody flavor. So I like Speyside whiskeys. I didn't want to overwhelm you with peat and smoke. I think that's definitely it's a acquired taste. We could talk about that if someone wants to go into that. And then Tullamore Dew is a nice classic Irish whiskey as well. So I didn't want to go and do something that's really unusual so that you think that your experience with Irish whiskey is something that really doesn't kind of reflect what the tradition of Irish whiskey is, which is a lighter, a perfumey, a nice bouquet kind of whiskey. They're all high quality, all of them.
Great. So I guess we're going to end the question and answer segment with one last question. If you had to choose one type of whiskey for a night with friends, and you're tasting with people that might know a lot about whiskey or might not know anything about whiskey, which one do you think would be a good whiskey for everyone to enjoy?
Bourbon right now, for sure. Everybody's curious about bourbon because it's not fussy, right? You can just make a cocktail with it. You can throw it on ice. You can throw it on any kind of glass. You can be outside, you can be inside. And it also seems to work in different temperatures. So it also depends on who's paying.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope that everyone who attended this evening has enjoyed this presentation. I've learned so much on top of the knowledge that I've already had. Every time I, have an opportunity to engage with you, I'm always learning something new. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, guys. It was really nice to be here.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I hope everyone has a wonderful evening tonight.
Okay. Oh, milamandgreene.com, whiskey.com if you're. Thank you.
Thank you.